Welcome to ENside Politics, the weekly podcast of how San Antonio politics really works. I'm Greg Jefferson, Metro Editor of the San Antonio Express News, and I'm joined today by City Hall reporter Molly Smith and our special guest, District 5 Councilwoman Teri Castillo. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Hey, thank you.
So when Gordon Hartman was on our podcast a few weeks back, he insisted that you worked a second job outside of council. So we'd love to know, what's that job?
So a lot of folks call me the People's Champ, and that's a title that's not a side hustle. It's something that I take very seriously, and that's something that I do as a city council member, ensuring that I'm advocating for the policy that supports District 5 residents, ensuring that D5 residents are receiving the infrastructure investment that they deserve, and that takes full-time commitment that goes beyond the 9 to 5, and maybe the after the 5, right? Maybe what is the second gig, but it's still the city council role.
So no job outside of city council.
No.
Just to be totally clear.
Yes. And I'm curious to what the assumption is.
I was gonna say, any thought on
I'm doing?
Where that might, like, have you encountered this before? The idea that you have a second job?
No. And so I'm like, what are folks saying? What is it I do? Who do I work for?
Right. Well, that's what we want to know.
Yeah.
Right?
I'm interested as well at what they believe I work for.
And you're one of a few council members who doesn't hold a second job. I know voters just approved a pay raise in the November 5th election. It'll bump council's pay from about $46,000 to $70,000. I'm curious if you think that will result in more of your council colleagues only working their council job.
I would hope during the council debate around the propositions, one of my expectations was that we would have full-time commitments. I think that's the expectation that San Antonio residents have of us, is that we are full-time. And ultimately, right, ensuring that it is a livable wage for folks with families, and just doing the work, right? And I think being a full-time council member, you do see the results. And an example of that is within my first term, and I think going to the other proposition around term limits, I also challenged that 2 years wasn't enough to get things done. But it does require a lot of work and a really good team. And I'm grateful that during our first term, we were able to double our bond investment. And that took debate, that took being out in community after 5 o'clock. And we were successful. And because of that full-time work, my constituents are seeing more improvements in infrastructure. But I think if I had another side hustle, I don't think I would have the time to be out and engage my constituents that they expect of me and that they deserve.
Did you have problems making a living at $46,000 a year?
I'm grateful that I live in a dual income household, so we live comfortably. But I think about single parents, right? And I think one of my colleagues who resigned to take a higher paying job was an unfortunate example of how we do need to look at compensation for city council members. But again, right, with the expectation that we're full-time council members.
Now, you were elected at $46,000, and it sounds like you believed that you were taking a full-time job and nothing else should really deflect you from that. What about your colleagues who do work second jobs? You have 3 lawyers on council who still see clients. Do you object to that?
I think the trend that we saw, right, those that were opposed to the council pay did have a higher income jobs in addition to being council members. And I think looking at our attendance as well, it's reflected based off of where our commitments are. And ultimately, I think, it's up to the constituents of that district to make that determination whether...
Who do you have in mind when you're saying... It sounds like you're saying that there are council members who are absent because of their work maybe in court.
I can't speak to why people are absent, but there are trends of folks that, are out. And I that's their prerogative. But I think it's up to their constituencies to also identify those gaps and say, hey, where's my council member? Why are they not debating this issue?
You talked about the term change that voters approved, where it'll now be a 4-year term versus a 2-year, but you'll still be capped at 8 years of service. So that means you're running for election this May. You're going to be running for your final council term, so your final kind of 4-year term, since you've already have served 4 years. How do you see that longer term impacting your service, but also the fact that this is going to be your kind of last term as a council member?
I think a couple of pieces, right? I take pride in our office's constituent services work. One of our constituent services director helped us establish what we call Office to the People. And it's acknowledging that all of our residents aren't coming to our field offices and aren't calling us. So it's door-to-door engagement with residents to gauge what their priorities and needs are. And then we connect them to city services. So ultimately, I see the continuation of that work that we've done, but far less fundraising, right? Which takes time. So I think, with the 4-year terms, right, you still have to fundraise to get reelected. But I think ultimately you can just continue to focus on constituent services work rather than fundraising for reelection.
How does a 4-year term versus a 2-year term, how does that change a city council member's relationship to the city manager?
I'm not too sure, right? I think we'll see, but I know the city manager is a professional, and I have an expectation that we'll see the continued initiatives and work that we've had under 2-year terms. Mm-hmm.
Did you feel in the past that because you were going to be up for election in 2 years and you needed kind of to show some results to constituents, that you really had to be on Eric Walsh's good side in order to get funding for things you wanted or his okay on policies?
So I think, and I listened to y'all's previous podcast, right, where y'all had this conversation.
It's a recurring theme, yeah.
And going back to, he is a professional and we have our disagreements, but we'll move on to the next initiative, the next issue. And ultimately, we both have the same shared priority, which is the residents of San Antonio. So the argument of like slow rolling projects and we're needing to be on his good side, I think one, right, we should all be professionals to where we are in good standing with each other. But two, we have that same shared priority, shared constituency, and our goal is to keep things moving along to improve the quality of lives for San Antonio residents.
Mm-hmm. Now, so is that the case?
That's the case.
Okay.
I think he's been doing a phenomenal job, and I don't expect anything to change going from 2 to 4 years.
Right. Now, also, among the 6 charter amendments that passed was Prop C, of course, which removes the pay and tenure cap on the city manager. What was your position on Prop C?
Yes, so during the debate around Proposition C, I was opposed to Prop C because of the pay cap removal. The argument made for city council pay is that if we tied it to AMI, there would be an incentive as a body for us to improve poverty and the average median income in the city. And I think the same argument stands for city management pay, right? If we tie it to the city's lowest paid employee, there's an incentive for the city manager to balance the budget that also improves the wages of the city's lowest employee. And given that component, I was opposed to Proposition C, but ultimately it did pass. And now that's what the results that we work with.
Yeah. Were you, so you were really kind of focused on the salary cap, tying it to the lowest paid city worker. So were you okay with the elimination of a tenure cap? Because as it was, he could only be in office 8 years before he had to step down.
Yeah. So, going back to the proposition to create the pay cap, right? I think the voters had already made a decision that this was their expectation. And the proposition essentially was undoing a decision that folks had already made. But my main friction was with removing the pay cap because that impacts so many city employees, and there's opportunity in the same way, right? Going back to the argument that they made about us is we'll want to improve the quality of lives because we want to get a pay raise. And the expectation, the argument is, well, city management should, if they believe they deserve a pay raise, right? The city employees are the function, right, and the bloodline of the city. So if you're doing a good job, that's a reflection of the folks doing the work on the ground, and they also deserve pay raise.
It seems like council could decide to give Eric Walsh a pay raise by the end of this year when you all do his annual evaluation, and I'm guessing that's the time you could make amendments to his contract. Would you support giving him a pay bump?
I think there's a number of moving pieces, right? I think he has been doing a great job. I've been impressed with his professionalism and his responsiveness to District 5 residents' needs. But there's also a larger conversation with city council members, right, for us to hear each other and hear what the consensus is. But ultimately, when there's a need, an issue, he and his team are responsive. And they work diligently to work towards a resolution. But I would also like to hear from my colleagues, right, what has their experience been like as well? Because we move as a body, and I want to take their experience into consideration as well.
Can you describe for us his last performance evaluation by council? How'd that go?
What I will say is what I've shared now, right, is that I think he has been a professional and has worked towards meeting the needs of San Antonio residents. If there's an issue that I call about, he is responsive, and we work collaboratively to ensure that we're meeting the need of the resident or the district as a whole. So that's what I would say to that.
Yeah. So his current contract doesn't include any kind of performance bonus, right? That could come back. Would you support a performance bonus for the city manager?
So my understanding is with city employees, there is not a performance bonus. And I think it's important for there to be consistency amongst the rank and file employees as well as city management. So if that is the case, then I would be opposed to a bonus if there's not opportunity for rank and file city employees to receive a bonus.
Okay.
We have one more election question. How should the city and the city council stand in relation to an emboldened Governor Greg Abbott and an incoming president-elect Donald Trump?
I think there's a number of moving pieces, right? And this also ties into the conversation around housing. When we look at just past votes, right, around raising the Soapworks apartments in replacement of a baseball stadium and luxury housing, when we look at the shift of the Opportunity Home leadership towards, more RAD conversions, essentially, right, more public-private partnerships with eventually selling off the public good, we see why there has been distrust brewing within the sentiment because of the actions that we've been taking. And ultimately, in conversations with constituents, they see those actions and they tie it to an administration. And I have a conversation about these are actions of your local government that are taking place and causing this impact. So just seeing some of the policy that's been moving in the rhetoric around housing in particular, I don't think there'd be much of a contrast, right?
So are you actually, I just want to make sure I'm understanding you correctly. So when you talk with constituents about the Missions baseball stadium and the raising of soap factory apartments, they're blaming that on what, Governor Abbott?
So when I talk to constituents and they're bringing up just the overall economic pressures, the lack of access to affordable housing, right, it is being blamed on larger administrations. And then, of course, right, council does get some of that heat as well. But ultimately, it's all blurred, right? They're seeing an increase in homelessness. They're seeing their children not have access to affordable housing. And, right now, it's just the system as it's working. It's all of us. And I think under a Trump and or continued under Abbott, right, we're going to see the continued housing pressures that we've seen under the Biden administration.
Are you afraid of more legislation coming out of Austin, kind of like the Death Star bill in the last one, which basically barred cities from enacting any kind of regulation that was stronger than what state law allowed for a number of areas, business licensing, development, that kind of thing. What are you anticipating starting in January with the new session?
Yeah, during council conversation, we just expressed, the need to continue to protect our ability to govern locally. But I think I can't speculate for what's about to come up. Some of my colleagues have that experience governing under a Trump administration. And ultimately, right, I think we have to know what are the fights worth fighting? And, when our constituency comes under attack, what's our response? And how do we navigate what's to come? Because we don't know until we're faced with what that issue is. And I do think that we should have more continued conversations around our federal delegation and what our initiatives, how in alignment are we, right? And just make sure that we're all in alignment on what the issues are here in San Antonio.
Do you see yourself going up to the ledge this session and testifying in behalf of or against bills that would impact San Antonio?
So, while the bills continue to be filed and things come up, I think I will take that into consideration. I did during the last legislative session around vouchers. District 5 had experienced school closures. 4 out of our 5 school districts within District 5 experienced school closures. And, what was pointed as the reason for that was charter schools, lack of affordable housing, and then a decline in the birth rate, right? So I had a responsibility to go out there and challenge vouchers on how that would continue to essentially divest from our public schools and potentially result in more vacant buildings in District 5.
You wrote a guest commentary for us last month in which you said that the city's Strategic Housing Implementation Plan, better known as the SHIP, lacks what you called a clear explanation of housing theories guiding our policies. We wanted to start by first having you kind of giving us a simple explanation of what the SHIP is.
Yeah, so the SHIP is the guiding document for housing for the city of San Antonio. It's the Strategic Housing Implementation Plan, and it lays out goals and expectations for policy for council to enact. And essentially that will help us meet our 10-year housing goals. And in terms of theory and things that we need clear expectations on, is it seems that while we are investing with a housing bond and we are seeing the establishment of a community land trust policy, we're also chopping things down before they grow, right? And what that looks like is raising naturally affordable, occurring affordable housing like the Soapworks apartments, and that's city facilitated because without the MOU, there's no deal. So the city council is facilitating the raising of this affordable housing stock that's very expensive to recreate. And whether it's market rate or public housing, it costs the same to construct. And we know this, but we're still making it, we're still allowing ourselves to remove that housing stock that we know is going to be very difficult and expensive to replace.
Aside from the vote for the public financing terms for the ballpark, which involves the raising of the soap factory apartments, are there other recent instances where you believe that a city decision wasn't in alignment with the SHIP?
Yeah, so I think the current leadership of Opportunity Home has taken a direction of the previous administration of David Nisibocha to essentially re-enter public-private partnerships. And with these conversions, typically through RAD, tenants lose protections, and then you also see ultimately the privatization of that public good. And, you know, I've spent the weekend reading over Project 2025's HUD chapter by Ben Carson, and essentially what the direction of the new board is Project 2025 diet. And that's concerning that we're allowing a board that's appointed by the mayor to make these decisions that are ultimately going to cause such an impact to residents in San Antonio, right? And what that impact is lack of access to affordable housing. Yes, we could talk about the quality and the need to invest in improving the conditions of this stock, but ultimately the replacement of it is going to take so much layering, a capital stack that we don't have the funding for. So it's disappointing that we have a board that's going to essentially perpetuate the housing crisis in the city of San Antonio, which is out of alignment with the Strategic Housing Implementation Plan.
Are you opposed to all public-private partnerships?
I'm opposed to removing our public housing stock with no place for those tenants to go, and then replace it with mixed income where no place for those tenants to go. So I'm not opposed to public-private partnerships. I'm opposed to converting our current public housing stock into public-private partnerships when there's no plan or units for those public housing tenants to be rehoused in.
If the SHIP isn't guided by clear policies, what do you see it guided by? Is it guided by select developers and their needs and their wants?
I think it's guided by a number of things, right? Public pressure, right? We saw the rezoning in District 10 where folks voted that rezoning down because
it was a tax credit project.
The Vista Park, property
yeah, but
project.
at 87 units, yeah.
Yeah, and I think, right, you hear pushback sometimes, right, from neighborhoods because of the density, the traffic, and so many issues. But ultimately, we also hear concerns about homelessness and lack of access to affordable housing. And I think it takes leadership to make that decision, and that we hear those concerns, but we're also working towards TOD initiatives, right? We're working towards a more pedestrian-friendly city of San Antonio, but we also need to work towards housing individuals. So I think that's another example. And some of the pressures is, you know, there's the public pressure because there is a process in which folks can say yes or no in the neighborhood. But as the council member, you have the ultimate decision-making power to say yes or no to the project. But just taking all the issues that we hear into account when making that decision is something that I would hope to see more of.
Were you surprised that vote failed, and it failed because it didn't get a supermajority? I want to say it was a 6-4 vote, but those 4 votes killed it. Were you anticipating heading into it that some of your colleagues were going to kind of give into that pressure and say neighbors don't want it, so let's not do it?
I was hopeful, just given we had just gone through the budget process, were the top 3 priorities, were housing, affordable housing, homelessness, and just we had a rich conversation about just how do we tackle this issue that's only swelling, and to see folks, say we're going with the home council member. I respect that, and that, you're respecting each other's boundaries, but we also have this shared goal that each of us know our constituents bring up, which is we're seeing more in-house people. Our kids are not finding access to quality affordable housing, and rent's getting higher, and mortgage interest rates are getting higher, and we still failed to create more affordable housing.
Now, on September 12th, City Council voted 9-2 to adopt, to accept the financing terms for a new baseball stadium. Right, with the designated bidders, the team ownership group. You were one of the 2 council members who voted against it. And that was largely because approving it would kind of violate the city's tax increment financing policy and the SHIP, which says don't put public dollars toward a project that's going to obliterate affordable housing. But the fact that 9 of your colleagues voted for it, you could easily take from that affordable housing for the city council in general is a very low priority. Is that right or wrong?
I think there's a number of different moving pieces with that. Like one, right, the financing structure. It was pitched to the public that there were 0 public dollars going towards the construction and or financing of this baseball stadium. However, the TERS and the financing structure diverts general fund revenue into this bucket that otherwise could be going to streets, sidewalks, infrastructure, affordable housing, so many things that San Antonio residents have voiced as a priority. So those diverted funds are now going towards the construction of a baseball stadium. And in order for that stadium to work out, it includes new development. And that new development is market rate housing and just spaces like mixed use space. And it's not being opposed to the mixed use space and or new development. It's that the city, right, city council and, the bureaucrats that help facilitate this deal essentially said, we want to see this project materialize, and this is how it gets done. And it gets done by using the TERS and essentially by disregarding the Strategic Housing Implementation Plan, which says that we should be seizing financing of market rate housing. So there were a number of city initiatives and policies that were disregarded for this project to materialize. And I know there's still, I think, like SAIC still needs to approve.
Right. So SAIC's board of trustees has to decide whether to sell 2.3 acres, which is currently for them a parking lot. But this is a critical parcel for this project. If my understanding is if they don't get this land, which I think might be in center field, they don't get a stadium. It's not going to happen. Are you in touch with board trustees at SAISD?
I have spoken to a couple, and what I've shared with them, and I intend to share with others if I do have an opportunity to have a conversation with them, is we just went through the school closure process and are now going through the revisioning process. And what they emphasized at those meetings was the lack of affordable housing near our schools. And what we're now having is the exchange of land to build unaffordable housing where SCISD families can't necessarily afford to live. And I think just to emphasize, that's what you told my constituents. And I think you have an opportunity here to establish community benefits to where there could be, affordable housing in this project if you ask for it, and if they really need that parcel to establish community benefits for SCISD families. Oh,
so try to leverage the sale of this land to rather have less market rate, basically housing in this project. And we're talking about what Weston Urban has committed to build around the baseball stadium. These are developments that will, pay for the baseball stadium through the TERS.
And I'm a bit of a cynic, right? My ask would be, of course, don't support this. It's going to result in the removal of affordable housing. But I'm a bit of a cynic in that I feel that, in the same way it moved through council, it may move through this board.
Did you feel that council had any leverage to demand that some of these new apartment units be affordable?
I felt that we did. However, I didn't hear consensus or the desire to secure those community benefits, right? Council was satisfied with a couple of free days at the field. And I think that's extremely insulting to taxpayers.
Now, I've asked this a couple of times in different interviews, and I can't tell if I'm just being stupid or not, but it was clear that the baseball stadium project was going to use a lot of public financing at the outset, and I'm talking about after designated bidders bought the team just about 2 years ago, nearly. It was pretty clear that it was going to require a lot of public financing. Why couldn't anybody from the city have said, okay, well, here are some parameters for whatever deal we ultimately, accept? That in one of them being, hey, don't destroy affordable housing. Am I being crazy? Is that unreasonable? Would that have been stupid to do? Well, I know it's a loaded question, but still, I mean, why didn't the city do that?
That's a question for the bureaucrats, but
also for city council.
Yeah,
I
laid out my expectations of the need for affordable housing. I took into consideration beyond the TERS. There's going to be concerns around traffic control and safety, right? And how much is that going to cost if we need to reconstruct roads to redirect traffic, right? And that's beyond the scope of the stadium, but ultimately it's to address the needs of the facility and how we're not taking those costs into account and how much is that increasing the cost of the overall amount of public investment in this project, because there'll likely have to be, traffic control with the police department and how much overtime are we talking about? And we have so many other needs. Is this where we should be investing our limited resources when we know we're going to have to be tightening our belt soon?
Mm-hmm.
What do you think the city needs to do? I mean, it has this housing plan, but what does it need to do to actually get more affordable housing, both build affordable housing, but also preserve existing affordable housing?
So given the shifted administrations, I think we'll see how much CBDG funding that we'll receive, how many other federal opportunities there are. And
may not be great.
Yeah. So I think there's a shift, and we need to see what the priorities are of the administration, and potentially exploring another housing bond in 2027, but increasing it from 150. 150 is barely one project, a full project. And I think we should have an expectation that we're really chipping away at the housing needs in the city, because I'm expecting that we're not going to see as much federal funding come down for housing department.
Under President Trump, maybe not. Yeah.
Last month, the City Council adopted a new policy for designating community land trusts. I wanted you to tell us what a trust is and how this new policy could help San Antonio get more affordable housing.
Yeah, so a couple of weeks ago, Council approved a community land trust designation policy. By state statute, it has to go through, you have to apply to receive the community land trust designation from a city, but the city also needs to apply to be able to facilitate that. And essentially what a community land trust is where someone owns the structure and then you lease from the land, right? So you're just paying for the structure itself. The nonprofit typically will cover the property taxes for the land, depending on the nonprofit and their structure. But essentially, you are just paying the cost of the structure. And typically, the ground lease is up to 99 years. So it preserves the affordability for those 99 years. And it reduces the amount that an individual has to pay because the nonprofit's covering the cost of the land. And the homeowner just covers the cost of the structure. And we're excited that there's nonprofits in San Antonio that are exploring community land trusts. One that's currently established is the Esperanza Peace and Justice Center. Cultural Lingua is also interested in the Mexican American Unity Council. And I think what's important about the community land trust, given the time that we're in, where we're about to have to tighten our belts, is there are so many vacant lots in the inner city. And this infill development with community land trusts is a tool for us to provide that deeply affordable housing for folks who currently live there if they want to continue to stay in their neighborhood. And then also, right, sometimes you have to invest to see a return, right? And the return is more folks house and in shelter. And now that vacant lot has a taxable revenue, right? So now the city can receive more funding when we know it had been sitting vacant and was a nuisance to so many neighbors. And this is one of the top priorities that we receive is just vacant lots and how they serve as nuisances. So community is excited that we're going to be activating these lots through the community land trust.
I know that you'd like to see the city transferring some of its properties to these community land trusts. Do you see that as something that San Antonio as a city would be willing to do?
So a couple of things, right? And with the community land trust and the city-owned properties, these are properties that they currently have in their inventory. We submitted a policy that we would have a tiered approach, given that they would go towards creating the deepest affordability, and then it filters up. There are a lot of vacant lots that, are currently in the probate process or don't have a clear title, and we don't have necessarily the ability to take on ownership of those lots. And it's important to clarify that because sometimes folks call us, hey, we saw about the community land trust. I have this lot. How can we get it in that program? Like, that's not how, how easy it is. So just wanted to make it clear for folks that it's just not any vacant lot that the city has access to and that will be considered for a community land trust.
Now, what kind of oversight does the city have of these nonprofits? I mean, the city must be watching what they're doing. I mean, there's all kinds of opportunity for, error, malfeasance, all kinds of stuff. How's the city guarding against that?
Yeah, the city has a good city audit team to check into compliance on these pieces. So my expectation is that they will continue to do their due diligence with nonprofits. And then there's also these nonprofits have reputations, right? And they want to ensure that they do right by the people. And of course, also taking into consideration, are they also currently delegate agencies of the city? And that's something that they already continue to be essentially, like, I don't want to say audited, but they're checked for compliance, right? So I think there's trust, right? Just given if it's a current nonprofit, I do believe that those current nonprofits should be prioritized for that reason, right? We know they're seasoned, we know they have good books, and we should be cautious if there's one that just sprouts up that doesn't necessarily have the infrastructure or the experience or history. So my expectation is that they'll continue to be in compliance.
Mayor Nierenberg has pinned a large part of his legacy on bringing more affordable housing to San Antonio. Some thought that if Kamala Harris was elected, that he might even be tapped as Secretary of the Department of Housing and Urban Development under her administration. What grade do you give him when it comes to how he's done on housing?
What I will say, right, is, again, going back to the current shift with Opportunity Home. And oftentimes, we just submitted a 3-signature memo to have a conversation about the appointment process for the mayor, because what we hear from constituents, or I hear from constituents, is you appointed this individual, you made this decision. And I say yes and no, right? Because there's no deliberation or conversation on who gets appointed to these boards. It pops up on the 8th session agenda. Yes, we do have the ability to pull and debate that person's merits, but there's opportunity for a better process for that, right? And that's what we're hoping to explore. And I think given just the priorities of San Antonio residents around housing and homelessness, to see him support a board that has made the decision to essentially shift from protecting public housing to supporting public-private partnerships is concerning, right? I think being supportive of raising naturally occurring affordable housing, such as the Soapworks, is concerning. I do give him credit for the housing bond, right? He did lead that initiative for the first of its kind in the city of San Antonio. But I think, there's just pieces that I'm concerned with. And again, going back to reading Ben Carson's chapter, The Current Direction of a Board he appointed, it's not much. It's concerning. So that's what I'll say to that.
Reminiscent.
So as a former substitute teacher, do you have a letter grade that you would give him?
I think, there's still a lot of things to take into consideration. We have the home rehab program, minor rehab program, under one roof program established by Robert Trevino. I think I would say, as someone who went to school to be a teacher, I've always been about grades. I'll say there's room for improvement.
So last couple of questions, both of them having to do with the upcoming mayor's race. Obviously, affordable housing is probably your biggest issue, right? Is it going to be represented in the mayor's race at all, do you think? Or is it going to be kind of a side issue, if one at all?
I would hope, again, right, given the last 2 budget surveys by San Antonio residents, they've identified the priorities. And yes, housing's my jam, and I enjoy reviewing and submitting housing policy. It's the priorities of San Antonio residents that they've identified budget after budget. So,
well, from what you've seen of the mayoral candidates so far, is it being addressed?
I think Dr. Rocha Garcia, who's the chair of PCDC, as well as the San Antonio Housing Trust, I definitely believe she has the experience and tools. But in regards to the other candidates, to be fair, I've been focused on working towards meeting the needs of D5 residents. And my hope is no matter who the mayoral candidates are, that they are having their platform reflect what the residents have identified as their priorities, which is evident in budget surveys.
Yeah. Have you, I assume you're planning to run for re-election?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Have you, I also assume you've been approached by various candidates for mayor looking for your support. Is that the case?
No, that hasn't been the case.
Really?
Yeah, I wonder why.
Do you have a favorite? Well, let's go through the list. So we've got John Courage from District 9. We've got Manny Pelaez from District 8. I'm going to guess, maybe not him. Adriana Rocha Garcia from District 4. And probably at some point soon you'll have Melissa Cabello Haverta from District 6. Maybe at some point you might have Gina Ortiz Jones. It's, she's kind of in the air. There's a lot of talk about her joining the field. You've got Beto Altamirano, tech entrepreneur, and
your former colleague.
Yeah, right.
Clayton Perry, who likes to talk about how often he works with you.
And do you like any of those for mayor?
What I will say, right, they didn't ask for my support, but
regardless.
No,
are you leaning toward any one of them?
So what I will say when I'm looking in a mayoral candidate is one, right, ensuring that their priorities and platform reflects what we've been hearing from San Antonio residents. And selfishly, right, my colleagues have had the privilege of hearing me talk about District 5 priorities within policy and budget, right? So they're equipped with that information. It is something that could be learned on the doors and in conversation with community, but they know the ins and outs of what my constituents have run into, what policies that, they see as barriers. And what I'm also looking for is someone who has experience governing under a Trump administration. I think this is something that we don't know how it's going to play out for Texas and San Antonio. He's well seasoned now. So my expectation is someone that knows how to bob and weave under a Trump administration. And then what I'm also looking for is folks just grounded in community and San Antonio residents that prioritize workers' rights and workers' compensation is what I'm looking for.
Right. So in terms of just dealing, you mentioned dealing with a lot of bobbing and weaving under a President Trump and maybe a Governor Greg Abbott also. Is that to say you're looking for somebody who's just really pragmatic, or it sounds like you're not looking for a fighter so much, somebody who will is looking for an opportunity to draw a really clear line of distinction between the city and the Trump administration?
I think it's important to have someone that knows and understands risks, right? To have a risk analysis depending on what's coming through the pipeline, which fights are worth fighting. And there's a lot of good fights, and I'm always down to take one on. But I think it's going to take just experience on how to navigate and ensure that we're bringing home what we need to bring home for San Antonio residents. And I think that has a lot to do with relationships. I think that has a lot to do with just how to communicate with one another and how to be respectful. And that's what I think we need, because we need to continue to deliver for San Antonio residents. And I think if we're looking at just starting fires, that's not going to be productive for the people in San Antonio.
Right. What are the fights worth having?
I think there's a number of things, right? Investing in deeply affordable housing, accessible housing. I think ensuring that we continue to protect workers' rights. And to your point with Senate Bill 2127, that really strong preemption bill, which would limit us from allowing construction workers to have access to a water break. So I think those are a couple of examples of things that we need to continue to defend our right to govern locally and ensure that we're being the advocates that we were elected to be for our constituents.
All right. Councilwoman Teri Castillo, thank you very much for joining us. And thank you for watching. We will see you next week. And by the way, if you have not signed up for the ENside Politics newsletter, go down to show notes if you're watching this on YouTube and sign up there. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next week.